Welcome back to the domain of Buddhist Audio Bookshelf. Today, we resume our exploration of Dharma Talks by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, Geoffrey DeGraff. Let's delve deeper into these thought-provoking teachings together. Crafted meticulously by our team at Buddhist Audio Bookshelf, this audiobook shares the wisdom of Buddha. Your support in spreading these teachings is invaluable. Subscribe, like, and share to extend the reach of these transformative insights. Let's nurture a world enriched by the profound guidance of Buddha. Relax and absorb these teachings' essence as we journey on this enlightening path. Let's get started with the reality principle. April 14, 2006. Those 5 reflections we chanted just now. We're subject to aging, illness, death, and separation, yet we have karma as our refuge. Actually, that's only a part of the contemplation that the Buddha recommended. He also said to go on to think about the fact that all beings, men, women, children, lay or ordained, past, future, no matter what their level of being, are subject to aging, subject to illness, subject to death, separation, and have karma as their refuge. The 2 sides of the contemplation are meant to produce 2 different reactions. The one we chanted just now, that's to make you realize that you've got to get your act in order, to straighten out your life, because what you do makes all the difference in the world. The second side of the recollection, though, is to give you more of a sense of samvega, a sense of dismay over the nature of the human condition, to expand your perspective first, to look for a way out, and second, to get a larger sense of compassion, realizing that everybody is subject to these same problems. This gets you thinking in terms of the sublime abidings, the Brahmaviharas. Limitless goodwill, compassion, appreciation, and equanimity, not just for your friends and family, but for everybody, because everybody is subject to these same problems. And it's not just that we're subject to aging, illness, and death. The Thai translation of this passage is interesting. It says, aging is normal, illness is normal, death is normal. We forget about that, so it's good to expand your perspective to realize how normal these things are. There's the famous story of the woman whose child had died, and she couldn't accept the fact that it was dead. She went around asking people for medicine for her sick child, so people sent her to the Buddha. And the Buddha told her that it would be possible to make a medicine for the child, but it had to be made out of mustard seeds. Well, mustard seeds are easy. Those are the cheapest things you could find in India. But, he added, it had to be from mustard seeds from a family where there had never been a death. So she went from house to house to house asking for mustard seeds. Everybody was willing to give her mustard seeds, but when she added the condition, they'd say, "Oh no, we've had a death. My mother's died, my father's died, my grandparents, aunts, uncles, children had died." Ultimately it hit home that her child was dead. She was willing to accept it because she realized this was a normal part of the human condition. If we had a decent education system, it would teach us how to deal with aging, illness, and death, but we don't have much training in that. Our education system is designed to make us producers and consumers, and the skills we develop in that direction are not necessarily good for the mind, not necessarily helpful for dealing with aging, illness, and death when they come. This is what the Buddha's training is all about. You go to a monastery in Thailand and that's the first thing you hear. We're all subject to aging, illness, and death, and the lesson is how to learn not to suffer in the face of these things. We're all subject to separation. How do we not suffer in the face of that? Those are the real issues. This where the teaching on equanimity is important. It's the Brahmavihara that helps prevent the other Brahmaviharas from causing us to suffer. We want all living beings to be happy. We see that some are suffering and we want to help them. Sometimes we can, but often we can't. That's where equanimity has to come in, to put your mind in a larger frame of reference. That we're all subject to our actions. So the question is, what can you do? Equanimity does not teach there's nothing you can do. It simply points out the areas where you can't do anything, so that you can focus on the areas where you can be of help. It's basically a reality principle. Notice in the statements for the 4 Brahmaviharas, The first three start out, may all beings be happy. May they not be deprived. May they be released from stress and suffering. It's may. It's a wish. But equanimity is the reality principle. All beings are the owners of their actions. There's no may in there at all. It's just a statement of fact. So you take that as your foundation for looking to see where you can be of help, both in terms of your own suffering and the suffering of other people. Then you can act accordingly. That's when you can actually be helpful. One of the principles of equanimity is simply to accept the fact that aging, illness, death, and separation are normal. The question is how not to suffer around these things. That's something you can do something about. You know the teaching about the man shot with one arrow who then shoots himself with another arrow. The first arrow is the pain that comes with having a body, having a mind. These things are inconstant, stressful, and not self. That's the first arrow when pain comes up. But then there's the second arrow, and it's not just one more arrow. Often it's hundreds of arrows that we shoot ourselves with, as we get all wound up around the suffering. Those are not necessary. And those are the ones that really cause suffering, really place a big burden of the mind. If we didn't have those other arrows, the first arrow on its own wouldn't reach the mind. Our misunderstandings, our tendency to get all upset around the suffering. Those are the arrows that really hurt, based on craving and ignorance. So those are the ones we want to learn how not to shoot ourselves with, because when we stop shooting ourselves with those, then there's no suffering at all. So you have to sit down and face the fact of aging, illness, and death. These things are inevitable. We haven't gotten past them. So what do? The Buddha says there are 4 reasons why death scares us, has us in fear. 1 is attachment to the body. The 2nd is attachment to sensual pleasures. The 3rd is the knowledge that we've done cruel and harmful things to other people, to other beings, and the fear that after death, we're going to be punished for it. And then the 4th is not having seen the true Dhamma, having doubts about the true Dhamma. Now if we can learn to overcome these 4 fears of death, death won't bring suffering. And only when we've got a handle on these things can we really be helpful to other people. This doesn't mean that you have totally overcome the fear, but if you learn to deal with your fear of death so that it doesn't freak you out, then you can help other people as they approach death, too. So this is why this is not a selfish training. It really does put you in a better position to be of help if you sorted through your attachments to the body, sorted through your attachments to sensual pleasures, learn to focus on the positive things you've done, realizing that punishment for the bad things is not necessarily inevitable. It's even better if you gain a Dhamma eye, a vision of the true Dhamma. That's when you can totally overcome your fear of death, when you can really be helpful to other people. But this doesn't mean you have to wait until that point. Take this issue of being afraid of the harmful things you've done in the past. The Buddha says that it's not inevitable you're going to have to suffer from them. He gives the analogy of a lump of salt. Say you've got a lump of salt the size of your fist, and you put it into a glass of water. You can't drink the water because it's much too salty. But if you find a large clean river and throw the lump of salt into the river, you can still drink the water, because the salt gets so diluted by the quantity of the water. That's an analogy for a mind that's developed the 4 Brahmaviharas. When you develop these limitless qualities of mind, and the mind becomes very expansive. And it's the nature of such a mind that the results of past bad actions don't have such an impact. They don't impinge on the mind as much. So this is one very good reason to develop these qualities of mind. When the results of past bad actions come, they don't hit you as hard. And you can train other people who are ill or close to death in the same skill. Get them to develop this larger, more compassionate, more equanimous state of mind. You can start by reminding them of their generosity. The good things they've done for other people in the past, the bad things they've avoided doing. These are forms of generosity. These are forms of compassion and goodwill because they open up the mind and make it more expansive. When the mind is in a more expansive state, the amount of suffering grows less. So it's good to develop these qualities in the mind. One way of developing them is to learn how to develop the same attitudes toward your breathing. Have goodwill towards your breathing, compassion, appreciation, equanimity for your breathing. In other words, allow the breath to be comfortable so you can have a foundation. Where it's not comfortable, work at making it more comfortable. That's compassion. Where it is comfortable, appreciate it. Sometimes, especially in the very beginning, the states of comfort seem to be very minor and not impressive at all, but that doesn't mean they don't have the potential to become more impressive with time. You've got to give them a little space. It's like oak trees. When they first come out of the ground, they're pretty small, a little tiny acorn. Of an even better analogy is a coastal redwood tree, which has the tiniest little seeds, and yet the tallest trees on earth come from these tiny seeds. Develop the conditions, allow them to grow, and they become a huge forest. It's the same with the sense of well-being in the body. First, find areas that are simply not in pain, that seem okay. That's good enough. And then be very careful to keep them okay. Don't let the way you breathe push or pull or squeeze them in any way at all. Just let them be all right continuously, all the way through the in-breath, all the way through the out-breath. They'll begin to grow, to develop a sense of fullness. And then you can allow that sense of fullness to expand through whatever parts of the body pick it up. As for equanimity, when there are areas that you can't improve, develop equanimity for them. Focus instead on the areas where you can make a difference. Don't get worked up over the things you can't improve, because that gets in the way of seeing where you can make a difference, where you can be of help. Once you get practice in developing these attitudes toward the breath in your own body, it's a lot easier to develop the same attitudes toward other people because you're coming from a sense of well-being inside. You realize that no matter how bad things get outside, you've still got a safe place inside where you can go. And from that position you can see more clearly what needs to be done, and you have the strength to do it. So reflecting on the nature of the world, trying to develop these qualities partly as your own protection, so that you don't have to suffer more than is necessary, and secondly so you can help other people. You put yourself in a better position to be of help, because you're coming from a position of strength and well-being. This is just one of the most basic lessons you need to learn in what would be a decent education, learning how to deal with aging, illness, death and separation. And fortunately, even though they don't give us much of an education like this at school, we can educate ourselves. Mindfulness defined. April 20, 2006. What does it mean to be mindful of the breath? Something very simple. Keep the breath in mind. Keep remembering the breath each time you breathe in, each time you breathe out. The standard translation for sati mindfulness is probably derived from the passage in the Anglican prayer book that says, "Be ever mindful of the needs of others." In other words, keep their needs in mind. Even though the word mindful may come from Christianity, it's the closest we can get in English to what sati means in the Pali Canon. Keeping something in mind. So, be ever mindful of the breath. As for watching the breath, or accepting the breath, or whatever else we're told mindfulness is supposed to be doing, those are actually other qualities in the mind. They're not automatically a part of mindfulness, but you want to bring them along wherever they're appropriate. One quality that's always appropriate is being watchful or alert. The word for alertness is sampahana. Being alert to what you're doing, alert to the results of what you're doing. These two qualities, keeping something in mind and being alert to what that thing is doing or how you're relating to that thing, should always be paired as you meditate. In the discourse on establishing the frames of reference, these two qualities are combined with a third quality, atapa, or ardency. You really stick with what you're doing. You put effort into it. This doesn't mean that you have to sit here straining and sweating. It means that you're continuous in your effort. You don't let things drop. Psychologists have shown that moments of attention are just that. Moments. You can be attentive to something for only a very short period of time, then you have to consciously return to it if you want to keep on being attentive to it again and again. This means that you need to keep remembering to stitch those moments of attention together, from moment to moment to moment. That's what mindfulness is for. It's what keeps the object of your attention in mind. Whatever your frame of reference, the body, the breath, that's all mindfulness has to do. But if you look through modern books on meditation, you see a lot of other definitions for mindfulness, a lot of other things it's supposed to do. The poor word gets totally stretched out of shape. And this is not just a matter for nitpicking scholars to argue over, because if you don't see the different qualities you're bringing to your meditation and don't understand the differences among them, they all get glommed together. That makes it difficult for real insight to arise as to what's going on, as to what you're actually doing with the meditation. I've heard of mindfulness defined as sacred presence. I've heard it defined as affectionate attention or compassionate attention. Actually, though, affection and compassion are separate qualities. They're not mindfulness. If you translate them into the Buddha's vocabulary, they mean goodwill. That's a good quality to bring to the meditation, but be clear about the fact that it's acting in addition to mindfulness, for an important part of meditation lies in seeing when things like this are helpful, and when they're not. As the Buddha says, there are times when affection is a cause for suffering, so you have to watch out. Sometimes mindfulness is defined as appreciating the moment for whatever pleasure it can offer. In the Buddha's vocabulary, that's contentment. Contentment is useful in areas where you're experiencing physical difficulties, but it's not always useful in the area of the mind. In fact, there's a passage where the Buddha said that the secret to his awakening was that he didn't allow himself to rest content with whatever attainment he had reached. He kept reaching for something higher until there was nowhere higher to reach. So contentment has to know its time and place. Mindfulness, if it's not glommed together with contentment, can help keep that fact in mind. Sometimes mindfulness is defined as total acceptance or radical acceptance. In the Buddha's vocabulary, acceptance equals equanimity and patience. Equanimity means learning to put aside your preferences and just watch what's actually there. Patience is the ability to stick with things even when the results don't come as quickly as you'd like them to. But in the context of the Buddha's training, you put up with unpleasant things not just to endure them or to accept them, but to watch them. You realize that if you react too quickly to things, throwing things away when you don't get results as fast as you want, you never understand anything, never gain any results that are lasting. So patience and equanimity are needed to see things clearly. But once you've clearly seen that a particular quality is harmful for the mind, you can't remain patient or equanimous about it. You exert whatever effort is needed to get rid of it and to nourish skillful qualities in its place. That means you're bringing in other factors of the path. Right resolve and right effort. As we're meditating, we're combining all kinds of qualities of the mind, and you have to be clear about what they are and where they're separate. That way, when you notice that things are out of balance, you can identify what's missing and can foster whatever is needed to make up the lack. It's not just a matter of just piling in more and more and more mindfulness. You've got to add other qualities as well. First, you're mindful enough to stitch things together, to keep the basic issue of your meditation in mind. Then you watch that's alertness to see what else is needed. It's like cooking. It's not the case that if you don't like the taste of the soup you're fixing, you just add more and more and more salt. Sometimes you've got to add onion, sometimes garlic, sometimes oregano, whatever you sense is needed. Keep in mind the fact that you've got a whole spice shelf to work with. And you don't want every bottle on the shelf to be labeled salt. You want to know precisely what the contents of each bottle are. That's why it's good to read the Buddha's teachings. Some people make a virtue out of ignorance, saying that if you read a lot of the texts, it just clutters up your mind. There may be times when that is the problem, but other times the problem is that your ideas about what can be done in the meditation are too narrow. When that's the case, reading the texts can open your eyes and expand the range of your imagination. For instance, there's the old issue of the relationship between mindfulness and concentration practice. The Buddha never made a clear division between the two. In his teachings, mindfulness shades into concentration, and concentration forms the basis for even better mindfulness. The fourth jhana is where mindfulness becomes pure. The 4 frames of reference, the focal points of mindfulness, are also the themes of concentration. As Ajahn Lee notes, when mindfulness, the ability to keep something in mind, grows stronger, it becomes the jhana factor called vitakka or directed thought, where you really keep your thoughts focused on one thing consistently. As for alertness, it provides the foundation for another jhana factor, vicara, or evaluation. You notice what's going on with the breath. Is the breath comfortable? You can make it more comfortable if you like, a little bit longer, a little bit shorter, deeper, more shallow, faster, slower. When you've found a way of breathing that's comfortable, you can spread that sense of comfort throughout the body. That makes it easier for the mind to become one with the breath. Meditation is not just a passive process of being present with whatever's there and not changing it at all. Mindfulness keeps stitching things together over time, but it also keeps in mind the idea that you want to be able to settle down here. There's a purpose to mindfulness practice. It's meant to lead to concentration, from there to discernment, and from there to release. That's how its role is always portrayed in the texts. So you do what you can to make the breath a place where you can stay concentrated, where the mind can feel more and more at home. In this way, evaluation is an important part of the practice. Getting a sense of what's pleasing to the mind and adjusting things so that it's happy to settle down. You can play with the breath, remembering that the breath isn't just the movement of air coming in and out. It's also the entire energy flow in the body. For the purpose of concentration, it's good to get sensitive to that, the energy flow in your legs, the energy flow in your arms, in your torso, in your neck, your shoulders, all around your face, your eyes, your ears. When you breathe in, where do the currents of energy flow? Think of the body not as a bellows that pulls air in and pushes it out. Think of it as an energy field that exchanges energy through every pore with the energy field of the world around it. Notice which sensations indicate where the energy is blocked, which areas of the body seem starved for breath. You can feed them, you know. Make a survey. Which part of the body doesn't seem to participate much in the energy flow? Let it participate for a couple of breaths, and then see which other part needs to be nourished. It's like feeding a flock of chickens. You throw a little scrap of bread to this one, a little scrap to that one, until all the chickens are well fed. This not only makes the present a more comfortable place to be, but it also gives the mind something to do so that it's not bored. If you can get interested in the breath, that interest can grow into absorption, in other words, jhana. There's a lot to discover in the present moment. Insight doesn't come from being non-reactive, from simply by putting up with whatever is there. It comes from testing, experimenting. This is how we learn about the world to begin with. If we weren't active creatures, we'd have no understanding of the world at all. Things would pass by, and we wouldn't know how they were connected, because we wouldn't have any way of influencing them to see which effects came from changing which causes. It's because we act in the world that we know about the world. The same holds true with the mind. You can't just sit around radically accepting everything. If you're going to learn about the mind, you have to be willing to play with qualities in the mind, to play with sensations in the body. That's when you begin to understand cause and effect. You begin to understand the principle of intention. What role does intention play in your experience? It goes a lot deeper and is more fundamental than anything you might have imagined. Your whole experience of space and time is based on certain intentions that are repeatedly being made on a very subtle level. To see these things in action, you have to be willing to experiment in your meditation. That involves the desire to do it, persistence, keeping at it, being really intent, focused on what you're doing, and using your ingenuity. Using all of your powers of intelligence. This doesn't mean book intelligence. It means your ability to notice what you're doing, to read the results of what you've done, and to figure out ways of doing things that get better and better results. Street smarts for the noble path. Mindfulness allows you to see these connections because it keeps reminding you to stay with these issues with every moment, to stay with the causes until you see their effects. But mindfulness alone can't do all the work. You can't fix the soup simply by dumping more salt into it. You add other ingredients as they're needed. Sometimes what you need in the meditation isn't what you expected. That's where alertness shades into evaluation, and evaluation into ingenuity. As Ajahn Lee says, evaluation is the quality that leads to discernment. We're training the whole mind, so we need a whole range of mental qualities to complete the training. Mindfulness is where things start, but it can't do all the work. It needs other qualities to help it. As you realize that, it helps expand your imagination about what you can do here, what tactics you might try. That's why it's best not to load the one word mindfulness with too many meanings, or to assign it too many functions. If it carries too many meanings, you can't clearly discern when you need to see the difference between, say, what goodwill does, and what equanimity does, when you need one and don't need the other. So even though mindfulness combined with alertness is said to be the most helpful quality in the mind, it too needs help. This means that you have to gain a clear sense of what you have on your spice shelf, and which spice is good for which purpose. Only then can you develop your full potential as a cook. Chew your food well. June 24, 2006. The mind has a habit of feeding on things. And for the most part its feeding habits are pretty bad. It feeds on all the wrong things and it suffers as a result. Like a person who just takes anything at all and stuffs it in his mouth. He's sure to damage his digestive system and his body as a whole. But the feeding of the mind is much more complex than the feeding of the body. The mind tries to feed on sensual things, but they don't give any satisfaction. It tries to feed on becoming this or becoming that, and whatever it becomes doesn't last very long. Then it gets all disgusted with the whole thing and wants to destroy everything, so it feeds on the idea of destruction. When it doesn't have anything left, it has to start all over from scratch because it still needs to feed. It hasn't gotten over the need to fill the big gaping hole it feels inside. Part of the Buddha's genius was to realize that there are other ways of feeding the mind, skillful ways that bring it to the point where it doesn't need to feed anymore. That's what the path is all about. It's a different way to feed. The word for feeding and clinging are actually the same in the Pali. Upadana, the things you cling to as sustenance for the mind. And basically what the Buddha has us do in the path is to take our old habits of feeding and apply them in new ways. We still hold on for a while, we still cling for a while, but it's not quite the same as the clinging that causes us to suffer. In other words, we don't hold on to these things as ends in and of themselves. We hold on to them as a path, as tools. The Buddha allows for a certain amount of sensual pleasure on the path. He tells you look at your practice. If you see that when you indulge in certain pleasures it doesn't harm the mind, then they're okay. Some sensual pleasures, he says, are out of bounds. They can't be skillful by any stretch of the imagination. But in other cases, it really depends on the individual. Some people find that they can meditate perfectly well in busy surroundings, whereas other people have to go off and live in the forest. Some people find that they can eat a nice moderate diet without any problem, while other people practically have to starve themselves. It's really an individual matter. But even when you starve yourself, the Buddha doesn't have you totally starve yourself. It simply means that you eat less than you normally might like for, after all, the body does need food to keep going. The same with the other forms of clinging, such as attachment to views. As the Buddha points out, there's right view. Right view starts as an understanding about karma. And it's interesting to note that when the Buddha talks about karma, the first two things he focuses on are gratitude and generosity. If you don't see the virtue, the value of gratitude, if you don't see the value of generosity, it's hard to do anything else on the path. You have to appreciate the good that other people have done for you, and see that something really good does come from being generous. Generosity is not a sham. It's one of the things that makes life worth living. If you don't appreciate the good that other people have done for you, the ways they've been generous, how are you going to be generous yourself? How are you going to be a good person? This is why the Buddha has you reflect on generosity and gratitude as the very basis for any kind of practice. From that point, right view moves on to an understanding about suffering. why we suffer, how we suffer, what we can do to put an end to suffering. That kind of view is a useful tool because its very nature is not to be taken as an end in and of itself. It's a means to put an end to suffering. It's a good view to feed on, a good view to apply as a tool. The same with clinging to habit and practices. The Buddha wasn't just talking about rituals. Any type of practice, any type of precept, any kind of habit, if you take it as an end in and of itself, is a kind of clinging and therefore suffering. But in the path of practice, we have precepts, we have practices, we develop good habits. You practice concentration, you maintain the precepts as means to an end, because these kinds of precepts and practices really do nourish the mind. They strengthen you. If you know that under no circumstances would you ever kill, under no circumstances would you ever steal, there's a very strong sense of self-worth that comes from that knowledge. If someone were to come and offer you $1 million to lie and yet you could say no, that means you've got a precept that's worth more than $1 million. A great sense of self-value comes with that, and that's an important food for the mind. It really strengthens the mind to have a precept, to have a practice like that. And even views of the self. The Buddha doesn't have you totally drop any view of what you are, or of what kind of self you've got. You can create a sense of self as a strategy in lots of skillful or unskillful ways, and he recommends the skillful ones. Being generous, being virtuous, following the path, meditating. These require a sense of self that's responsible, a sense of self that can practice deferred gratification. Then when that sense of self has taken you as far as it can, you realize it's a strategy, and there are times when that strategy doesn't work, you drop it and move beyond it. But again, we need that kind of strategy to get anywhere on the path. So the Buddha teaches you to hold on to things as part of the path. The image he has is of a raft. You use the raft to get across the river. When you've gotten across the river, you don't need the raft anymore. But while you're still on the river, you need the raft. Otherwise you drown. So make sure that this raft you're taking here is well lashed together. This is why we spend so much time practicing the concentration, because it's the centerpiece of the path. Only by holding on to a good state of concentration can you get across the river. So, where's your concentration right now? How do you develop it? You give the mind something good to focus on, like the breath. If the breath isn't enough, you can add the word Buddho together with the breath. Bud with the in-breath, Do with the out. Buddho means awake. No matter what else happens, there may be the sound of traffic or music off in the distance, or pains in your legs, or whatever, don't let that deter you. Don't let that distract you. Just stay here with the breath. Those other things don't really destroy the breath. Even though there may be noises off in the distance, you've still got the breath right here. It's simply your choice. Where are you going to focus your attention? Focus it on something good. Focus on eating good food, not on junk food. And do your best to give yourself a good foundation. Of all the different elements of the path, concentration is the one the Buddha most often compares to food. A sense of stillness, a sense of well-being that you can create here in the present moment. It is a creation, it is something put together, which means that it's not the goal of our striving, but it certainly is the path to that goal. So just stay with the breath. Feel the breath in the process of breathing. Where do you feel it? Where do you notice it? Where can you see most vividly? Now the breath is coming in, now the breath is going out. Well, focus right there. And then allow that part of the body to feel comfortable. You may notice that at the end of a breath it tends to feel squeezed or strained. That's a sign that the breath is too long. If you've been breathing in and don't quite feel full, allow the breath to get longer. Learn to experiment. What feels good right now? What feels right for the body right now? What feels right for the mind? That makes the breath a lot more interesting and more useful as well. If you can create a sense of well-being in the present moment, it's a lot easier to stay here for the whole hour. As you settle down with the breath, you begin to notice other parts of the body as well. You begin to realize that the whole body can be involved in the breathing process. There's energy throughout the whole body. So make a survey of the body to see where there's tension. Is there any tension related to the in-breath? Are you holding on to tension with the out-breath? Where? In your hands? In your feet? Well, let them relax. You're working on your raft here, so make sure that it's a good raft. You don't want it to fall apart in midstream. Have some pride in your workmanship. The more attention you pay to the breath, the more you can feed off it, the more solid your foundation is, then the more trustworthy your raft. So think back on any skill you've ever developed in the past and apply the attitudes that worked there to this skill here. Pay careful attention to what you're doing. Try to notice even the slightest stress that you're causing, the slightest tension that you're creating in the process of breathing, and learn to let go of whatever is causing that tension or stress. If you find that that's too much to focus on right now, just stay with any spot in the body where you can keep tabs on the breath and try your best to make it comfortable right there. Learn to be a connoisseur of your breathing. Okay. What kind of breathing really feels good right now? You're the one who decides. So experiment. Deep breathing might feel good for a while, and then you decide that it doesn't feel so good anymore. Well, you can change. Pay attention to what you're doing with the breath. As with any craft, the more you pay attention to what you're doing, the better the results are going to be. And this raft you're working on will become a good solid raft, one that doesn't fall apart when the currents get strong, the kind of raft that can get you all the way across. If you want to think of the concentration as food, okay, chew your food well. In other words, pay really close, careful attention to what you're doing. Don't just try to gulp it down. Choose good food, chew it well, and you'll find that it gives you the strength you need. You don't have to go feeding in other ways. You're learning new habits here, new ways of feeding the mind. And as with any change in diet, in the beginning it may be a little hard, it may feel a little unnatural, but as you get used to eating health food, you reach a point where you look back at the old junk food you used to love, and you realize you can't stomach it anymore, because the health food really does make your body feel better and stronger. You realize that you crave junk food because you didn't know any better. The junk food created a sense of lack that made you crave more and more junk food. It was a vicious cycle. But now you're getting out of that cycle. You've got an alternative. Instead of gobbling down sensual pleasures, getting sick of them and then trying to trash everything, you've got an alternative way to feed, one that doesn't cause any harm to anybody. Ultimately you get to the point where you don't have to feed anymore. The raft gets you all the way over to the other side. That's when it has done its task and you can really let go. But in the meantime, as long as you have to hold on to good things. That's the only way you're going to get across. The basic pattern. June 27, 2006. The passage in the canon where the Buddha is teaching his 7-year-old son is one that bears frequent reading, frequent reflection, because it contains a lot of the really basic principles of the practice. Basic not in the sense of Buddhism for dummies, basic in the sense of containing the essential pattern of all the teachings. You can look at these instructions as the Buddha's introduction to meditation practice, because meditation doesn't start on this cushion, it starts in your daily life. The Pali word for meditation, bhavana, means to develop good qualities in the mind. And it's important to look at the qualities that the Buddha's recommending that his son develop. The discourse starts with a passage on truthfulness. You get the feeling that his son, Rahula, probably lied during the day. When the Buddha comes to see him that evening, Rahula sees him in the distance and sets out some water for washing the feet. As the Buddha washes his feet with the water, he leaves a little bit of water in the dipper. He shows the little bit of water to Rahula and says, "See how little water there is in this dipper?" Rahula says, "Yes, sir." The Buddha says, "That's how little goodness there is in a person who feels no shame at telling a deliberate lie." You can imagine Rahula cringing. Then the Buddha throws the water away and says, "See how that water is thrown away?" Rahula says, "Yes. That's what happens to the goodness of a person who feels no shame at telling a deliberate lie. It gets thrown away like that." The Buddha then turns the dipper upside down and then shows him how empty and hollow it is, each time with the same message. That when you feel no shame at telling a deliberate lie, your goodness gets turned upside down and is empty and hollow. So what the Buddha is establishing here is the principle of truthfulness. That you're honest about what you do. And this means being honest not only with other people, but also with yourself. Honest about what? The rest of the discourse goes on to point out that you're honest about your actions before you act, while you're acting, and after you've acted. Take a good close look at what you're planning to do, what you're doing, and what you've done. Before you do it, look at your intention. This act you're planning to do, what result do you expect from it? Are the results you expect going to cause any harm? If they are, don't do it. So there's an important principle right there. That your intentions are important. The consequences of your actions are important. And you want to act in a way that doesn't harm anybody. This is the beginning of compassion. While you're acting, and this covers not only physical actions, but also the things you say, and even the things you think. Look at the results that are happening while you're still engaged in the action. Sometimes things happen that you didn't expect. If there's any unexpected harm, stop. If you don't see any unexpected harm, you can continue with the action. When you're done, reflect on the results your actions have had over time. If you see any unexpected harm, then if it was a verbal or physical action, go and confess it to somebody else who's had experience on the path. Get advice from that person. If it was simply a mental action, the Buddha says to develop a sense of distaste for that action. You don't want to think in those ways ever again. This establishes the principle that you shouldn't be ashamed or try to hide the results of your actions from other people. You should be open about your mistakes. If you can be open about your mistakes with other people, it's a lot easier to start being open about them with yourself. At the same time, you learn from the wisdom of other people. The Buddha doesn't recommend that you reinvent the Dhamma wheel every time you act. If, however, you notice that there was no harm from your actions, the Buddha says, take joy in your practice and continue with the training. There are a lot of important principles here. The principle of truthfulness and integrity, the principle of compassion. These things are essential to the practice. Even the Buddha's most refined teachings on the topic of emptiness follow the same pattern. Get your mind in a state of concentration and then look at it. Don't make assumptions about what it is, but just look at the intention maintaining that state of concentration. See where there's any disturbance in it, appreciate where there's a lack of disturbance. Lack of disturbance here corresponds to a lack of harm. The disturbance can be equated with harm on a very subtle level. But the important thing is that you look at your meditation in terms of action and result. All too often, when people reach, say, a sense of infinite consciousness, they slip off and identify with the infinite consciousness as their true being or the ground of being from which all things come, and to which they all return. They make all sorts of assumptions based on that perception. Or they can go into the state of non-perception, where there's nothing there at all, and make assumptions based on that, forgetting to look at the fact that the state of concentration was something they did, and now they're experiencing the results. Like any other action, the concentration has to be viewed as an action and judged by its results. So whatever level of practice you're on, whether it's simply day-to-day interactions with other people or working directly with your mind, this is the pattern the Buddha has you adopt all the time. Look at your intentions, look at your actions, look at their results, and then adjust things based on what harm you see your actions have done. If you see that the results aren't as good as you'd like, go back and look at the intention, change the action. This requires two principles: integrity and compassion. These are the basic Buddhist values. These are the basic values of the practice. And they can be applied at any level. Among students in a classroom, or just interacting with other people in general, or as you're sitting here meditating. Remember, you're doing something. The principle of karma, which is the Buddha's basic teaching, underlies everything, reminding you that your actions are important, that they do have consequences, and that you have the freedom to change the way you act. If you see that the consequences are causing harm, causing suffering, you can change the way you act. You have that freedom. You can learn from your mistakes. After all, the Buddha himself started out making a lot of mistakes in his practice. All those years of self-affliction, extreme austerities, 6 years of a big mistake. And imagine the pride that went along with that. He was able to do without all kinds of pleasures, all kinds of comforts. He practically starved himself to death. He held his breath until he went unconscious. He ate so little food that just with the effort of urinating or defecating, he would fall over. He was so weak and thin. And in a case like that, what keeps you going? Usually, a strong sense of pride. You can do without things other people can't do without. But finally the Buddha was able to overcome his pride and realized that there was something wrong with what he was doing. This couldn't be the right way. There had to be another way. And he totally changed his understanding of the practice, totally changed the way he practiced. As a result, he was able to find the way out of suffering. So as we practice in our imperfect ways, it's good to remind ourselves that the Buddha himself started out imperfect as well. As we make mistakes, it's good to remind ourselves that the Buddha made mistakes, too, but he also pointed the way out of your mistakes. You can change the way you act, and it's important that you do because your actions shape your life. The pleasure and pain you experience in life comes from your actions, not from anything you innately are. So when you notice that there are problems in your life, look here at what you're doing. What are your intentions? What are your actions? What can you change? This requires that you be very honest with yourself, that you have the integrity to admit your mistakes, to see the connection between your intentions and the results of your actions, and the compassion, both for yourself and the people around you, not to want to cause harm. Once you've developed this integrity in your day-to-day life, then it's a lot easier to bring the integrity into your meditation, because integrity lies at the basis of meditating well, too. This is why the precepts are so important. They develop this quality of integrity. If you can't be honest with yourself on the blatant level, then it's very hard to be honest with yourself on the subtle level of the practice. So it's good to keep reflecting on those instructions to Rahula, because they focus on the basic principle that underlies everything in the practice. Your actions are important, so be very careful. At the end of the Buddha's teaching career, he closed with the words, "Bring your practice to completion through heedfulness." What does it mean to be heedful? It means that you have to be very careful about what you do, because what you do does make a difference, and it does make a difference to be heedful. If everything were totally predetermined by some principle of fate or ironclad causality, nothing would make any difference at all, and the Buddha wouldn't have had any reason to teach. Or if your actions didn't really make a difference, there would be no reason to be heedful. But they do make a difference. And the care you take in looking at your intentions and looking at the results of your actions, that's what determines whether you'll be able to complete the path or not. So when you're looking for a Buddhist principle to apply in all areas, this is it. Be careful about what you do, be heedful about what you do, because it makes an important difference in your life. Equanimity isn't apathy. June 29, 2006. There's a discourse where the Buddha teaches his son, Rahula, how to meditate. Before he teaches him breath meditation, he tells Rahula, "Train your mind to be like the earth. When foul things are thrown on the earth isn't disgusted. When fragrant things are thrown on the earth doesn't get enchanted." Then he goes on to the other elements. Fire burns trashy things and isn't disgusted by them, and it burns fragrant things and isn't delighted by them. Water washes away dirty things, it washes away fragrant things, but it doesn't feel one way or the other about them. Wind blows foul things around, and it blows fragrant things around, and it doesn't get disgusted by the one or excited by the other. So having established this principle of equanimity, this principle of not letting your mind get elated by good things or depressed by bad things, the Buddha then starts in with the teaching on breath meditation. But he doesn't teach Rahula to be apathetic about the breath, saying, "Well, just accept whatever breathing there is." Part of the instructions is to train yourself to breathe in such a way that you're sensitive to the whole body, that you experience pleasure, that you experience rapture. These are trainings, things you have to will to happen. So equanimity doesn't mean apathy. It means putting your mind in a position where it's able to learn about cause and effect. You want to observe how things actually happen without your likes and dislikes getting in the way of seeing what's actually going on, but you have definite preferences underlying your desire to observe. You want to observe so that you can learn how to breathe in a way that's comfortable. You want to develop rapture. You want to develop pleasure because these things are important in the practice. You need them to keep going. Without them, the practice gets dull, apathetic, and dry. It begins to burn out. What the Buddha was training Rahula in was a state of mind that's able to see cause and effect. Often when things go really well, you get excited and you lose it. When things go bad, you get disgusted and you drop it. You aren't stable enough to observe why they're good, why they're bad. You don't learn either way. The attitude the Buddha wants is that when things go well, you learn why they're going well. Instead of getting carried away with how wonderful things are, you ask, what's happening here? What caused this state? Sometimes the analysis, if you do it while things are happening, will mess things up, so you have to learn how to do it right afterwards. Sometimes, though, it doesn't. If your concentration is strong enough, you can observe what you're while you're doing it. So, the issue lies in getting your mind in a state where it's willing to learn, where it's able to observe cause and effect, so you can master the skill. That's how equanimity functions. It doesn't mean not caring about what happens. You care, but you also care to learn about cause and effect. What really works in getting the breath to be comfortable, what really works in getting the mind to settle down. You can't just go on the power of wanting things to be this way or that. You've got to learn what actually works, what doesn't work. You may have some ideas about what should work, but when you find that they don't, you drop them. You're not attached to them. There's that famous passage where the third Zen patriarch says that the great way is not difficult for those with no preferences. In terms of the Buddha's teachings, there's only one way that makes sense, which is that you don't have preferences about what's going to work. You admit what works, you admit what doesn't work. There may be ways of meditating that you would like to see work, but if they don't work, you put them aside. There may be methods that you have a preconceived dislike for, but if you find that they actually work, you don't let your likes and dislikes get in the way. That makes the Great Way a lot easier. Look at the Buddha's teaching on the Four Noble Truths. You treat the cause of stress differently from the path to the end of stress. You try to abandon the cause and to develop the path. It's not that you say, I don't care which happens, whether it's stress or not stress. You do care. You care so much that you're really willing to learn, to put in all the time and effort required to learn. But you may find that it requires you to meditate on the 32 parts of the body. A lot of people don't like that, but it can be very effective. You realize that if you're going to overcome lust, you really have to look into the body, take it apart, section by section in your mind. Then do it again, and again, and again, however many times is required until the results really do cut through lust. You may decide that you prefer a path that's easy and pleasant, a path that involves just letting go, not having to make an effort, not having to develop any skill, not having to attain any goal. But when you find that doesn't work, you have to put it aside, along with all your preconceived notions. If a path that works takes a lot of work, don't be afraid of it. The mind has lots of ways of looking for an easy way out. All that work that goes into concentration. Practice is just an attachment, you might say. Well, I'm going to be beyond that attachment, skip over that, because I've already seen through it. You can't skip over it. You've got to go through the process because mastering the process is what develops your discernment. The mind can find all kinds of ways of avoiding the effort in the practice. You might decide, well, I'm just not up to this. I'm not good enough for this. I'm not cut out for this. Learn to recognize that kind of thinking for what it is. It's the voice of laziness trying to find some way to get around the practice. As Ajahn Mahabua once said, don't be afraid of the effort that's needed in the practice. Don't regard it as an executioner. It's not going to kill you. It just may take more out of you than you might want. But think of the alternative if you don't do it. You end up looking back on your life, saying, gee, I could have put more into it, but I didn't. That's not a good way to look back at your life. It's better to say, I knew what needed to be done and I did it. Whether I got all the way or not, at least I gave it my all. If I haven't gotten all the way yet, I've got another lifetime coming up. I can work on it again. That's what it means to be a person with no preferences. You put in the amount of work that's required. You learn to develop the skills that are required. Whatever the path requires, you're up for it. If you don't feel up for it, you find ways of making yourself up for it. You're willing to put in all the meticulousness that it requires, and all the time, and all the energy, learning to be very, very observant. When you find something that works, then whether you like it or not, you master it. But if you try to plan the path out beforehand, that's just your ignorance talking, your preferences talking. You've been following your ignorance and your preferences for how many lifetimes? Sometimes they lead you to good places, but a lot of times they don't. So it's time to put them aside. Learn to develop the mind that's like earth. Learn to develop the mind that's like fire, not in the sense of burning you up, but in the sense of being willing to burn anything, likable or not. That's its natural duty. Think of the meditation as your natural duty. You're here in this body. This body is causing suffering for a lot of other beings, because in order to keep it alive you've got to feed it, you've got to clothe it, you've got to provide it shelter. Look at all the work that goes into providing shelter. We've been building these huts now for 2 years and they're still not done. For this body to stay alive, it's depending on the suffering of other people, other beings. When you put this body aside, you're going to get another one, and regardless of what kind of body it is, it's going to be the same process over and over again. There is, however, a path out of this process. It yields the highest happiness for you and doesn't impose anything on anybody else. The meditation is that path. So think of that as a duty. Whatever is required, you do it, without letting your preferences get in the way. Each of the Four Noble Truths has its own specific duty, is based on the preference not to suffer. You definitely do want to work toward the end of suffering. You do prefer that. That's a legitimate preference. The question is, what's required to get there? When you've learned the requirements, you do whatever is needed to be done even when you've completed the task. Look at the Buddha. Even after his awakening, he spent 45 years establishing the teaching, the Dhamma and the Vinaya. It took a lot of work. And he didn't do it with an apathetic attitude, thinking, I don't care whether it works or not. He put a lot of effort into making it a teaching that would last. He noticed that some people would take the teaching and use it to good purpose, but he didn't let himself get elated about that. There were people who listened but then didn't really put it to any good use. He knew how not to get depressed about that. He had established mindfulness in such a way that he did what needed to be done. Of course, he preferred to do a good job of teaching. But as for the results that came, how other people took the teaching, that's where he developed the mind that was like earth, water, fire, and wind. He did his best, but as for how other people would take what he did, he learned how to put that aside. So apathy has no place in the teaching. You need to have preferences. You do want to put an end to suffering. You have to see that preference as so important that you're willing to put all of your other preferences and especially your preference for apathy aside. As today's session draws to a close, we extend an invitation for ongoing engagement. Just as Buddha advocated sharing his teachings for the greater good, we urge your involvement. Help propagate these profound teachings universally by subscribing, liking, and sharing. Your active contribution ensures these invaluable insights transcend boundaries. Embrace this opportunity to ignite positive change and nurture empathy. We eagerly anticipate your presence in future episodes, uniting to enlighten minds and cultivate compassion globally.